Greetings! In this video we will rig our helicopter and create a basic demonstration animation of that rig working properly. Before we begin, let's clean up our outliner. I've got some groups here. You'll recall that in order to mirror, we group these together and put an X in the -1 in the X translate. So we've got these grouped here, and it'll be easier to parent if they are ungrouped. So we'll come to Edit Ungroup. So select any or all of your groups and hit Edit Ungroup. The next thing we'll do is move our plane. So our plane is in the midst of all these other polys. I'm going to hold down the middle mouse button and just slide that up. And you'll recall, if you drop with the double line, you're parenting. So now I've moved that plane up there and parented it to cylinder 12. We don't want to do that. When you're moving, make sure that when you drop, you're dropping on the single line, right? So that's a parent, that's a move, that's a parent, that's a move. So we're going to come up, we're not parenting it to the sky dome, we're not parenting it to the directional light. I'm going to lay it down in the outliner just in between those two, so that visually I can see that this plane is separate from the rest of the helicopter geometry. And then in fact we'll do one more thing with the sky dome and the plane. Since they're next to each other, easy enough to select them both, and we're going to put them on a layer and reference it, because as we're making selections on our helicopter, it's not uncommon to inadvertently select something in the background. So we'll preclude ourselves from doing that by referencing on a layer. Have both those selected, we'll create new layer, and then the third field out, of course, template and reference. Now when you click, we can't select those. And just don't forget, in the event that you need to make a ground plane or sky dome selection, your reference is on and you can turn that off in order to select in the standard mode. So take a look at the outliner. We've got our two lights and our ground plane, and then everything else is just the polys as part of our helicopter. And once you got that clean setup, you could do an increment and save. Let's position our joints. We're going to lay down a joint right for the helicopter itself. We'll create a joint for the main rotor and then a joint for the rear rotor. We want to begin by making sure that we're working with our joints in world space. So we'll, in the rigging mode, we'll come to Skeleton, Create Joints. We'll open the dialog box, and we'll make sure that Orient Joint to World is on. For this basic rig, we'll just use our joints in world space. And we'll lay down our first joint for the helicopter body itself, and we want it to be about the center of the mass. So that would be about right here. Now, I do want to grid snap that, so I'm going to just, to make that a little bit more clear, hide my polys, and then we'll hold down the X key, grid snap that, and we'll hit return. So bring back our polys. We've got a joint there, and it is in the center of the mass. If you wanted to move that, just hold down the X key and you could grid snap that around if you wanted to move that forward or backwards, but that's about right. We'll come back and grab our joint tool, and we want a joint, our second joint for our main rotor, and we want that to be right in the middle so that it rotates around. Now our rotor piece is blank in the middle with nothing to snap to, but we do have the post. So we'll hold down the V key, and my wireframe on shaded is on. That's this icon here. If you've needed to turn that on, wireframe on shaded. And we'll hold down the V key and just click, and that gives us a joint right in the middle. And I'll immediately grab my move tool, and we'll just slide that up. You can hit the F key to center that. And we'll slide that up, and that'll make it easy to select. And we just need it in the center in this direction so that the rotor is going around. We can pull that up or down. The Y value doesn't matter. All right, now for our rotor, we'll come back and grab our joint tool, and we'll come. And once again, because this is blank, we're going to create it on the post. So we'll hold down the V key and click. And we've got joint 3, you can see that here. I'll grab the move tool, and we'll just slide that out a bit. Joint 3, and we'll slide it beyond so that we can practical to select it. Now I'm actually going to delete that and just show you one other thing. Let's isolate select this. I'm going to create isolate select, And let's say you didn't have something to snap to. I'm also going to hit the 1 key just to make these edges a little more easy to see. We'll grab our joint tool, and in the event that you had a blank spot, but we needed this to be in the middle, you've got an edge down the middle this way and an edge down the middle this way. So we could snap to any one of those first, or either of those first, hold down the V key, and I'll snap that there. So that's on the middle this way. And how do we get it in the middle of this way? Well, we could grab the move tool and we could V-snap it to this edge, right, with the Z active. So my Z, which was blue, right, when I saw both colors, that meant that it was snapping in all directions. But now I've limited myself to the Z. And I'll hold down the V key and middle mouse button snap. And so that centered it. We snapped it to this edge, and then we constrained snapped it to this edge. So even if you don't have something to snap to for one of your pieces, as long as you've got a center edge on the other two directions, you can create that centered. So there we go. There's our joint. I'll pull it out a little bit. And now we'll complete the chain. We can hide our polys, and you can see the 3 joints there. And this is our root. This is the main joint. Oops, let me see. Sorry about that, my computer locked up on me. We're going to grab this joint, shift select this joint here, and hit lowercase p. So, right, this is the child, shift selected the parent, lowercase p. Select this joint, shift select the root, so child and parent, and lowercase p, or the long way, edit parent. And so that is our helicopter rig, very simple rig. We just have 2 moving parts, the main rotor and the rear rotor, and then everything else will be parented into the root there. All right, I'm going to open up my joint chain, and you can take a look here, right? Those 2 children are equal, joint 3 and joint 2. They're equal distance down the chain from joint 1. We'll go ahead and parent this in. We'll bring back all of our geometry, and you'll recall that 2 windows side by side is our best bet for parenting, and we're going to make both of these panels the perspective view. We'll say show none, show joints in one, and we'll say show none, show polys in the other. So we only have polys here. And easiest selection is to just draw a bounding box and then use the control key to deselect. So those are the 4 items. If you have more rotors or more pieces, it would be more than 4. But 1, 2, 3, 4, I've deselected those with the control key. Let me just do that again. Drew a bounding box, control key, deselected that which is not part of the body. And then we'll shift select joint 1, and we'll come to edit parent. And now joint 1 controls our entire body, and you can see we can move that there. All right, we'll do the same for the other pieces. We'll grab these 3, shift select this joint, lowercase p, or I'll go the long way, parent. And you can test that, rotate that around, and we've got our rotor going. And then our final piece to parent, we'll grab that rear rotor, shift select this joint, joint 3, and lowercase p, or we'll hit edit parent. And you want to test that, rotate that around, and that's working. So we've got our basic rig, and this is the most basic. We're going to talk about in the next section of this video and in upcoming video lessons some different approaches to building on top of this basic rig. But this is something you want to save, and you could call it helicopter rig start or helicopter rig basic. And in the next section of the video, we'll create a rig on top of this rig, if you will, for our basic helicopter animation. Be right back. Welcome back. In this section of the video, we'll create a secondary rig that sits on top of our primary rig. So you should have saved that version up to this point and called that base rig. And at this point, you'd want to do a save as and call this something like base rig transform node. We're going to create 2 additional transform nodes for this particular setup. You want to have that base rig available to you so that in future projects you could come back and start there. For instance, motion path would be a rig that would be applicable to a helicopter, and you'd want to start with that base rig. All right, I'm going to hold down the shift key and click the plus, and we see our entire rig there. And I'm going to say show polys, just to remove polys from the view. And we're going to group the root to itself. We'll do this twice to give ourselves a transform node for translate and a transform node just for rotate. So I have joint 1, I have my root node selected, and we're going to come to edit, group. And if I pick my move tool, we'll see that the pivot for the new node, the new group node, is sitting at the origin. I'll also hit the shift key next to the plus just to see that everything's still there. And we want to put this pivot at the exact same place as the root. So we'll tap the D key, and then we'll hold down the V key middle mouse button. I'm going to move that in proximity, and then V key middle mouse button, and then tap the D key to get out of that. And if you click off and on, you can see that the group 1 pivot is there and the joint 1 pivot, both in the exact same place. We'll do this a second time. We've got group 1 selected, and we'll come to edit, group. Pivot point jumps to the origin. You can hold down the shift plus just to see that everything is indeed still there. We'll tap the D key and just move it over into proximity, and then V key middle mouse button, or you could hold down the X key, right? Remember that our joint is sitting on the grid. So either V snap to the joint or X snap to the grid. In either case, the pivot is in the same place as the joint and the other node. We'll tap the D key to get out of that, and then we just want to check to make sure group 2 has the pivot there, group 1 has the pivot there, and of course joint 1 has the pivot there. And you could save this, right, not over the top of your original base, but if you've already done a save as, you could increment and save even. All right, let's move on. We're going to label these nodes. This would be rotate, and this will be translate. So the uppermost node is handling all of our movement, and the secondary node here is handling all of our rotation. Now, just because we've labeled this node translate, we've still got rotate and scale available to us. Likewise, on the rotate node, just because we labeled it, didn't do anything magical over here in the channel box. So we are going to take the added step of removing those nodes that aren't applicable to translate or to rotate. And we do that via a window called channel control. So we'll come to Windows, General Editors, Channel Control, Windows, General Editors, Channel Control. And I'm on my translate node, be aware of which node you're on, and we'll just remove everything. So I'm going to select rotate and scale, and we're moving that over to non-keyable. So when we hit S, those attributes don't get keys. Likewise, we'll move visibility off. So now translate only has translate available, and I can't mistakenly set keys on rotate or scale on my node that should be limited or that is reserved only for translation. We'll do the same for rotate. We'll select everything except rotate, and we'll move that over. And then we're also going to remove the Z. We'll animate just the rotate X and Y in this particular example. So we're going to remove the Z as well. And I'll go ahead and close that. So our translate has only translate available. Our rotate has only rotate available. And we're ready to animate. Go ahead and save that. Again, not over your original rig. We'll call this helicopter rig translate nodes or rotate nodes. And we'll be back in the next part of the lesson and we'll animate this. Be right back. Welcome back. Let's move on to the fun stuff, animating our rig. We'll bring back our polys. We'll hit the Shift plus here to see the entire rig. And let's just jump into the perspective view. We're going to come to frame 100. We'll be animating frames 100 to 200 in this lesson, and in the next lesson we'll animate frames 0 to 100, all of the blocks coming together. We'll select Translate, and we're going to just key all of this together. We'll hit S on the keyboard, 100, we'll come to 150, and we're going to raise this up. Now, the size of your helicopter is going to be different than mine, so you may need to change this value. We'll put in 50 here, and we'll hit S on the keyboard. So at frame 100 it's here, at frame 150 it's here, and then we'll go from 150 to 200, and we're going to move it out of the view. Because we haven't established our camera yet, we don't know exactly what this Translate X value should be. So I'll just put in 100, and we'll acknowledge that we'll most likely need to change that. We want the camera to move completely out of the view of the camera. But because we haven't established the camera position, we don't know exactly what that value should be. And we'll just hit S and key all three. So we've got at frame 100, translate Y is 0. Frame 150, translate Y is 50. And translate X is 0, and then at 200, translate X is 100. All right, so that would be considered blocking. It's just the basic movements. And then now we'll come back and add just some secondary movement. Let's say a little bit of up and down. So on our Y, let's say it comes down a little bit here. I'm going to say 165. And you can play with these numbers and these values. We'll have it come down a little bit. And I'm just going to key on the Y. I don't want to hit S in this case. And let me demonstrate why. If we open the graph editor, and you can see here, I'm setting keys on the Y. I want it to move up and down just slightly. If I hit S, I also get a key on the X. And if I was to do that a few times, we're affecting this smooth transition of the X. So I'm going to hit undo. And we can see that if I right click and key directly on the Y, key selected, I only get the key on the Y, and I don't affect the X. I don't get an accidental key here. And let's say we'll come here, and let's even move that up a little bit, and we'll key it directly. So kind of up and down, and then it matches its ultimate Y value. Oops, we'll play that. So it comes up and then moves out. Now we're going to play, we're going to make this a little bit more natural movement, but again we're blocking, and there's just getting some of that up and down. One thing we can note here is the Translate X, it's slowing out. So if we look at that, the Translate X, when we set a key, by default it's flat. We don't want this to slow down. We want to imagine that it's going on forever, or hitting a uniform rate of speed. So I'll select this key, right? This is our Translate X at frame 200. We'll grab that handle, and with our middle mouse button, we'll pull this down. So now the graph, it's starting out slowly as it begins to move laterally, and then hits a uniform rate of speed. Now it just stops here because we're only going to be rendering to frame 200. But we could turn on infinity. That gives us some flexibility if we wanted to render some extra frames on either side. When you're editing in an application like Premiere or After Effects, any third-party editor, it's a good idea to render some frames before and after the action, just to give yourself some flexibility for when the cut takes place. So we'll make sure that our infinity is on, View Infinity, and then we'll come to Curves, Post-Infinity Linear. And you'll see as soon as I click this here, now it just goes on forever. And if we were to say, for instance, take a look at 250 frames, 250, right? It just keeps moving out of the scene for as long as you can render. So that just gives you some flexibility during the editing process. We'll go back to 200. All right, so it comes up and then begins to move over. And let's talk about a few other things. With that X translation, we'll come up here to Graph Editor. Yeah, that's good. And our Y, yeah, we'll call that a day on the translate. We may come back afterwards and manipulate a little bit more. But we can come to the rotate, and we'll set a key here. at frame 100. And then let's say at 150, we want this rotated around 90 degrees. So rotate Y 90 and we'll hit S. Right, so now that's coming up and then flying out. We can watch that. And then if you watch a helicopter movement, it doesn't stop on a dime. So it's really floating and kind of overcorrecting. And just as we gave a little bit of bounce to the up and down, let's do the same thing here with the rotation. So let's have it rotate a little bit more and then correct itself. So at 150, where we had it at 90, got a little bit more to 103, and we'll key that. And I'm keying it directly. And then let's say at 170, overcorrects the other way, right? So now it's less than 90. We'll key that. Let's say it overcorrects a little bit less, so just let's say 93 in that case. And then at 200, it's finally straightened out, and we'll key that directly. And we can kind of scrub through there. Now this, the other thing that we'll mention here, and here we're getting into kind of aesthetics and the art of key setting. We don't want, right, that feels a little artificial that both actions are taking place on the same keyframe. So we're going to offset the rotation here so that it's not matched up exactly at 150. Let's pull this to the left. I'm holding the Shift key and middle mouse button. And let's pull this this way as well. And we'll take a look at how that works. Yeah, there we go. So it's not completing its rotation at 150, which is when the Y translate is completed. They're slightly offset, and this works for something that's floating. The other thing that we can do with floating keys, especially floating on rotate, is to set them to spline tangents here. So yeah, sorry, couldn't see that icon. So there is the spline tangent. And let's select it, and we can grab these and hit spline. That'll give us a little bit more of a float feel, and you could even kind of correct that a little bit. And I'm going to pull this one over here. So there is our rotate Y. I think that should do it. And now we'll get our rotate X, and we'll move on to the propellers after that. But we've got to rotate, and our X direction, right, is here. And we've got that first key established. And as it's raising, maybe it's rear heavy. So we could maybe rotate that back a little bit, and we'll key it directly. We don't want extra keys on our Y rotate. So as it comes up, maybe it's a little bit heavy in the rear, and then we'll also have it overcorrect. So let's say here, it's now rotated forward, and we'll key that directly. And then by 200, we'll set that back to 0. It gets flat again. And we can take a look at that in the graph editor. And so this really feels like it's floating. Right, we'll come on, especially when we get these propellers going. There's a little bit of a jostle here, so let's take a look in the graph editor. We've got our rotate selected. And so that initial key that we had, right, when we set the key at 150, we'd hit S. And so we had a value, we had a key set here, and that's what that little kind of hiccup was. Probably should have just keyed directly on the Y, but we noticed it visually. Let me just come back here. Right, we only set the 3 keys, but we get this hiccup because there was a 4th key when we had set that initially at 150. So I'll delete that, and we'll go ahead and set this to spline. And so there's our X, and if we take a look now, that hiccup will be gone, and it feels like it's really correcting and taking off in the proper direction. There we go. All right, let's animate the propeller. Let's just look at that rotate one last time. So here is my rotate Y, and then our rotate X, and there they are together. Offset, and let's go ahead and select the translate. So here's our translates, X and Y, and then along with our rotates. And it doesn't have to be exactly like that, but that idea of a float type feel, and accelerating from stopped and then hitting a uniform rate of speed and moving out of the view. All right, let's animate our propellers. We have joint 3, so this is our rotate X. And we probably want it to start before 100, right? Because it's getting liftoff at 100. So let's say we'll start at 70. We'll key, yeah, we said that was X. We'll key this, and let's say by 100 it's a full revolution, and then we'll talk about how we could speed this up. So we'll key that. So that gets going, and we'll do the same with joint 2. So we'll come to 70, and this is our Y, right? So this isn't the same axis. We'll key the Y at 70. At 100, we'll give ourselves 360. And we'll note here we have to do two things. We need to set these to infinity because they start to rotate and then stop when it takes off. So let's do this one at a time. Since we have joint 2 selected, we'll come and we'll set this to infinity, but before we do that, we want it to hit the uniform rate of speed. So we selected that key, selected the handle, and with our middle mouse button pulled that down. So it's starting off slowly, and then it hits this uniform rate of speed. Our infinity is already on, and so we'll come to curves, post-infinity, linear, and now it's just going to rotate forever. And with this open, we'll come to joint 3. We'll do the same thing. Select the second key, move tool, pull that down, and then we'll come, our infinity's on, so we'll come to curves, post-infinity, linear, and now these will go on forever, and we can watch that play. And if we want that to be faster, let's see, those, press play here, those propellers might not be spinning fast enough. The rear rotor looks like it is. The main propeller looks a little slow. So what we can do, we'll come joint 2, and we'll just make that faster. We'll come to this value, and let's say 720. That would be twice as fast, right? So now it's, and our handle needs to be updated there. Yeah, that feels a little bit better. You could play with the speeds. But there we go. There is our chopper taking off with our rotate and translates keyed separately because we rigged them onto separate nodes. Now let's create a camera so that we can render this out. We'll come to animation, create cameras, camera and aim, create camera, camera and aim. And we're going to look through this camera. So we'll come to panels, perspective, camera 1. That's the camera that we just created. And we'll compose our scene. And this way we can position the camera so that the helicopter gets completely out of the view. We'll turn on a resolution gate. And what we want to do is just come to frame 200, and you can see it's almost out of view. Right, we'll pull that, and let's have it be real dynamic. We'll have it fly right past us. And then we have to kind of see how that's going to fit there. And then this was that idea, so I think this is probably the good composition. Maybe something like that. But we needed to go a greater distance. So here was the translate, and we mentioned at 200, translate X is 100. And we can, right at the beginning I mentioned we'll have to come back and dial this in. So we'll come to the graph editor. Here is that key, right? At frame 200, the value is 100. And we can do this in real time. In previous lessons, we've really been talking about moving keys horizontally to change the timing. Here's an example of where we'll hold the Shift key, middle mouse button, and pull this up. And in real time, we can see what the value needs to be to get that out of the view. So 188, right? And we'll also change that so that that is a smooth curve there. So our translate X, right, is 0 at frame 1, and it is 188 at frame 200. Now, with our camera, if you haven't been using cameras or animating cameras before, this often happens. You'll compose the scene and then accidentally move the camera. So once we've got our camera exactly where we want it, we want to lock it down. So I'm going to come to the camera 1 group, hit the plus key, and we're going to select camera and aim. So we've got camera and aim selected, right? I hit the plus next to camera group, selected camera, camera and aim, and in the channel box, and you can see that I have two things or more than one selected with the dot, dot, dot. We'll select all of the attributes, selected all of the attributes, not the fields, and we'll right click and we'll say lock selected. Right click lock selected. And you'll see that it's turned gray. I'll click off that and then reselect it. You can see that they're gray here. That means that we no longer have access to it, and I can't. If I hold down my navigation tools, you'll see that I am not able to move. So where do we start? 70, right? And let's go ahead and put that in our range. We'll just make it 70 to 200. That's what we're watching. And there we go. And there's our helicopter moving out of the scene. So you should be able to render that. We could just do a quick review. If you wanted to just check our lights, come back here, and it's kind of interesting to see the shadow being cast. We have a sky dome, and of course we have a directional light. We lighten the shadow on our, I'll dereference that, right, on our ground plane. We lighten the shadow a little bit on our directional light. We have in the Arnold section, my exposure is 2.3, my angle is 8, right, which is the softness of the shadow, and then samples 3, which is the quality of the shadow. And you can play with lighting, right? We're just lighting for volume. You can scrub through that and see that working out. So that looks good. Quick review, you would come into your render settings. I'm going to stop that. I just crashed here. I will put the render settings in the next section of the video as I restart. Good lesson to always save. And the reason I did, I was really scrubbing through that Arnold, and I have some other applications running, including Camtasia. So, fatal crash. Be right back. Welcome back, returning after that crash. We were just about to go into the render settings, which should be review, but we'll review it here real quick. We are going to name it. Image format is JPEG. Our name .number .extension. We're rendering frames 70 to 200. In the next lesson, we'll render out all 200 frames. We'll animate the beginning section. And then here, because we've created a camera, we need to designate that camera. Camera 1. Now, I'm rendering out full frame, 1920 by 1080. If you don't have the processor power to do that, you're rendering at 512 by 512 and creating an animated GIF, right? So if we do that, if we change our output 512 to 512, now we have different borders. You'd want to come to your camera, right? So here's our camera at the bottom. We hit the plus next to it. We've selected camera 1 aim. We want to click drag the attributes and we want to unlock it. So we'll right click and say unlock. Remember that we locked it just because we composed and we didn't want to accidentally move the camera and ruin our composition, because we want the helicopter to start in the center of the frame, raise up continue to be in the frame and then fly off to the right or to the left, depending on which way you have it go. And so we would need to recompose that. Now I can't play because the animation crashed before I'd saved it. But you would come to frame 200 and just make sure that it was completely out of the view. Once you had that with your 512 square, if you're rendering small, you could then relock that. Lock selected. So there's lock selected and unlock selected. Locking our 512 square. And then the other thing to note, since we've created a camera, in your Arnold render view, you have to switch to that new camera. So this doesn't have to do with the render settings. This is what our render sequence or batch render looks at, camera 1. And then when we're rendering an individual frame for evaluating light and composition, we are setting the camera here in the render view. And then you'll note we're not batch rendering because we get that watermark. So we are hitting render sequence. That renders in the foreground, which means you can't do anything else in Maya. So you'll need to set aside some time for Maya to be on but unavailable to you while it renders the sequence. Okay, questions in the discussion forum. Have a good one.